where the path from where you are and where God wants you is through an evil person. Let me say this again, just so you know your mic's on. Pastor Dan, mic's on. Have you ever been in a situation where the path from where you are and where God wants you is through an evil person? I've done martial arts for over 20 years, and one of the martial arts I have been doing more recently is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, essentially what you're doing is you're grappling, trying to find joint locks or chokes or pinning your opponent, and so it's kind of like wrestling with those aspects. And it can be a lot of fun. It's really arduous, but what's really difficult for me is I only weigh 155 pounds. Between 155 and 160 pounds. There are some guys who weigh 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, 75 pounds more than I do that I grapple with. Right? And in the midst of those times, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can be very unfun. Right? Because you're trying to grapple with this person and their mere weight is overpowering you, not even including their strength and their skill. And sometimes we feel like that in life. Sometimes we feel, okay, here is God. I know where God wants me, but I am coming against an overpowering opponent. You know where God wants you to go. You know maybe what the right thing is to do, but you have to confront that bullying boss. Or you have to engage that family member who has been horrible and abusive to you for years. Or you fill in whatever blank that is. Where God wants you to be, the course that God wants you to take, sometimes there are evil people that stand in the way of where God wants you to go. And this is the exact case of Esther in the book of Esther. A little bit of review. Esther summarized as this. There was this king named Xerxes, and he was a ruler seeking a new queen. And there was this Jewish man named Mordecai. And Mordecai raised this beautiful orphaned cousin, and her name was Esther. And he was like a father to Esther. You see, at this time, Israel and Judah were exiled. What that means was they were captured by other countries. And then Xerxes ruled over a country that overthrew some of these countries. And so here are the Jews, instead of being in their promised land, they're being scattered. And so it's difficult for them to follow God, but there are a group of people who are following God in the midst of being exiled. And Mordecai was one of those people. And so he brought Esther up in the Jewish tradition, following Yahweh, following the one true God. And he brought Esther up, a beautiful orphaned cousin, Esther. And then Esther entered this beauty queen pageant and won. So now she became Queen Esther. Queen to Xerxes. But in the midst of that time, there was this vice ruler. Haman was this vice ruler, and he, in this time, planned to annihilate the Jews because he was this evil person. Mordecai found out about this plot, and he told Esther that she must do something. And so Esther committed to risking her life for her people. We're going to be looking through Esther chapter 5 and Esther chapter 6 together today. But what I want to do is I want to summarize a little bit what Esther is doing at this point in time. Starting in chapter 4, the latter part of chapter 4, and starting in verse 15. And this is what it says. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So here is Esther, knowing that she will have to go before the king because Haman, this evil vice ruler, has come up and planned, and the king has actually put into edict to annihilate the Jews. And so here is Esther. Mordecai found about this, told Esther about it, and the only way that she can resolve the issue is by going to the king, by going to Xerxes, and allowing her to come into his court. If he does not allow it, she will be killed. But she is willing to risk her life for that situation. This is where we find ourselves right now in Esther chapter 5, starting in 1 through 8. And here's the main point of 1 through 8. Doing God's will take courage, it will take risk, it will take faith, and it will take wisdom. This is what Esther did. On that day of the fast, on the third day of that fast, so right as they were finishing the fast, this is what Esther did. Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, now this is the big, I wonder what King Xerxes will do. If he raises the scepter to her, then she has her life spared and she can come into his presence and she will be safe. But if he doesn't raise his scepter, then she will be killed. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter for her. It doesn't say that in that moment, but can you feel that sigh of relief that Esther must have felt in that moment, being like, okay, he's welcomed me into the courts. It continues on. So Esther approached and touched the end of his scepter. And when the king asked her, what do you want, King Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if half the kingdom. So not only did he grant her her life, but in addition to that, you can see the king's favor in Esther. You see, the greatest request that you could ask a king would be up to half the kingdom. Because if the king gave more, then he would lose all of his authority, and then you would be the one with the most authority. It's sort of like owning 51% of a professional basketball team, right? That means you're a majority owner. That means you're the one that's pretty much running the show. And so here is the king saying, Esther, what is it that you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. Almost everything that I have, I will give to you. Can you sense God's favor going before Esther right now? God isn't mentioned in this moment, but we can see him working behind the scenes. It continues on. Verse 4. And Esther replied, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. Isn't it interesting that in this moment, Esther says, I would love for you, King Xerxes, to come to a banquet. And in addition to that, I would love for Haman, this evil man. We'll get to that in just a second. The king turned to his attendants and said, tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, do you understand what that means? They're getting drunk, right? They're happy in spirits. They're partying like crazy, right? While they're drinking wine, the king said to Esther, now tell me, what do you really want? Because Xerxes knew that there was something behind going on here. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's up to half the kingdom. Esther replied, this is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about. And so what we see is Esther coming before Xerxes and saying, this is what I would like from you. I would like to throw you a party, and I would love for Haman to come along. And Xerxes is like, all right, let's do it. Now, what do you really want? And then again, Esther says, I would love to throw a second party for you and for Haman. Would you come along with tomorrow night? And they're like, okay, what is Esther doing here? If we look at the main point of this part, it's doing God's will require courage, risk, faith, and wisdom. What is courage? Courage is strength in the midst of fear. Tomorrow we commemorate Memorial Day. commemorating those who have died because they had the courage to sacrifice their lives for this country. Were some of them fearful in what they did? Yes. But courage is not the absence of fear. It's the midst of doing something that must be done in the midst of the fear. And here is Esther, who realized that she was going to risk her life in order to do something that God wanted her to do. The saving of many lives for such a time as this. And it took courage. Was fear non-existent? We don't necessarily know for sure, but we do know she was reasoning in her head, man, I don't know if this is going to work out. And if I were in Esther's shoes, first of all, that wouldn't be a pretty sight. But second of all, I would have fear in my heart. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the strength in the midst of fear. And so Esther had courage to do God's will when facing an evil person. But not only that, number two, she had risk. Risk is pursuit without guaranteed success. There's a pastor who's pretty well known in ministry. And he said this, as it relates to ministry, he says, when I make a decision to do something in ministry, I have max, maybe 80% certainty that it will come true. There are going to be times in our life when we are going to risk and we aren't going to be 100% sure that it's going to work out. We have plans to do good things for God. We have plans that this church would grow and God would use it. But did God guarantee in His Word that Sunrise Church is going to be anything about Sunrise Church? No. We're being led of the Lord. We're risking. We're giving to ministries in Malawi. And we're trusting that God is going to open up doors for us to continue to do work to bless this community with the gospel and with the goodness of Jesus Christ. That's a risk. And Esther was here saying, I don't know if I am going to die or not, but I am willing to take this risk. Doing God's will, especially when there's evil involved, takes courage, it takes risk, but it also takes faith. On the third day that they fasted, Esther went to the court, and this is what faith is. Unseen certainty. Faith is unseen certainty. Even though I can't see God working, I am going to trust in the fact that He is working. If we are going to live a life pleasing to the Lord, we are at some point in time going to have faith beyond our obstacles. And Esther had faith beyond her obstacles. She had courage. She was willing to risk. Why was she willing to risk? Because she believed in a God that was bigger than her situation. But then, not only that, she had to have wisdom. Wisdom is knowing not only what to do, but how to do it. Now think about it for a second. What would happen if Esther just walked into there and says, Haman's going to kill us, and I'm upset about it, and you need to do something, Xerxes? That probably wouldn't be the wisest way to approach a king, would it? But what did she do instead? She walked in, she showed humility, she showed honor to Xerxes, and even Haman said, I would love to throw a party for you. And then the next night, I would love to throw a party for you again. And what is this doing? Some of us might call it buttering up, right? But maybe it's this idea of tact and diplomacy. Maybe before granting a request, what you need to do is show appreciation. And so, Esther, what she showed was incredible wisdom in how to handle a king. Because we also know that there was another king right before Esther who didn't have the tact and wisdom to do probably what was appropriate, and she was banished from his presence. And so what we need to realize is that as we follow Jesus Christ, and as we do God's will, especially when there is evil coming against us, that we are going to have courage, that we are going to have risk, that we are going to have faith. But Esther shows and displays, and we need to take heed, that we also need to exert wisdom on how to handle the situation well. But then it continues on in Esther chapter 5, Esther chapter 5, 9 through 15. And what we will realize from this portion is that evil people rage, boast, flaunt, and plan destruction for their enemies. When we do God's will, what we need to understand that there will be times of trouble, and sometimes those trouble come from mean people, come from bullies, come from evil people. And these evil people will rage, boast, flaunt, and plan for destruction of their enemies. This is what it says in Esther chapter 5, starting in verse 9. It says, Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. Of course he felt happy. You know why he felt happy? Because not only was the king celebrated, but also Haman was celebrated. And so here is Haman walking out, second in command, thinking, man, I am on top of the world. Haman was a happy man and he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. So here is Haman, kind of a little tipsy at this point, right? Thinking, I am the bee's knees, right? He's walking through, and at the palace gate, who does he see? He sees Mordecai, his enemy. Mordecai had the Spirit of God in him. And he was not going to bow down. And he was not going to be afraid of Haman. And that angered Haman. So it continues on. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh his wife and boasted of them about his great wealth and many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. And so essentially he gathers people around him and he says, look at how great I am. Look at all the things my children are doing. Look at that out of all the people that Xerxes could have promoted, he has promoted me. Why? Because I am great. And Haman added, that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, but this all is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate. So what we see is this combination in Haman's life of rage, of boasting, of flaunting, and planning destruction for Mordecai. This is what we see. But what Haman doesn't realize is behind the scenes is that Mordecai and Esther are relatives. Continues on. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall. And in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. Did you know that evil people sometimes have no boundaries? Did you know that we as righteous people, we as followers of Jesus Christ, do have boundaries? And that puts us at a strategic disadvantage to evil people. But what they don't realize is that we have what? An almighty God. When I go in and I wrestle and I grapple these opponents who are larger than me, it can be daunting. It can be frustrating. It can be like, oh my goodness, in order for me to win the prize or in order for me to move on or get promoted, I have to grapple this guy? Are you kidding me? And sometimes in our lives, that is how we feel when we are trying to do good and there is someone evil in the way. But behold, let us remember this. In Esther chapter 6, there is a God who remembers and a God who works on our side. Not because we're great, but because we have chosen to follow him and has chosen to do what is right and good in his sight. And God will protect his children. This is what it says. Actually, verses 1 through 11 of Esther chapter 6. This is the main point of that. God works behind the scenes to bring about good and honor those who courageously follow him. Esther courageously followed him. Mordecai courageously followed him. And this is how God backs up his people. Starting in verse 1. That night the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of history and his sign, so it could be read to him. In those records he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bithana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. Who is that in the outer courts? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. Do you understand what's going on? Do you understand that here, Mordecai and Esther have no idea what God is going to do? All they are going to do is be courageous, risk, have faith, and use wisdom. And at the same time, there is this parallel story going on of Haman. And Haman, this evil man who wants to annihilate the Jews, sees Mordecai as the only person in his way. And so what he has planned in the midst of his boasting and all his grandeur, he has planned to build this 75-foot pole to impale Mordecai on so that everyone will see that and fear and worship Haman and fear and worship Xerxes. And Mordecai is like, I'm not going to bow down to you, and I'm not going to be afraid of you. And then who steps in? Who created that situation where Xerxes was not able to fall asleep? And so of all the things he reads the annals of history, maybe because it'll put him to bed, but he reads about this story of Mordecai. And he's thinking, man, how great is this Mordecai? And has he ever been rewarded for his hard work and for protecting my people? And so as Haman is about to walk in to talk to Xerxes about this pole that he wants to build to impale Mordecai, as he is walking in, Xerxes says, have you heard about this Mordecai? This is what I want to do. I want to set up a banquet for him. Only God could do that. God is the God who remembers. It continues on. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in. And the king says, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Now, at this point in time, I forgot to tell you this, Haman didn't realize who Xerxes was thinking about. Haman, in his boasting, had thought, oh, he's probably talking about me because I was the only guy invited with the king to be celebrated in the queen's presence. So it's probably me, so let me think about how I would like to party. Okay? So this is what's going on. Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on his head. Then let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. So here's Haman saying, this is exactly what I would like happen to me. So, Xerxes, this is what I think should happen to whomever you want to honor. Wink, wink. Verse 11, excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew. who sits at the gate of the palace, leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." We look at this account, we look at this story, and there are going to be times in our lives when we stand up against an opponent in order to do God's will, when we will have to confront evil, when we will have to confront bullies, and we are going to go in faith, trusting that I might be annihilated now, but that isn't going to stop me from doing what God has called me to do. And here is Esther, here is Mordecai, and the night before this all happens, Haman was planning to kill Mordecai. And now all of a sudden, he is helping him prance around the kingdom, saying, this is what happens to people who honor King Xerxes. Only God can do that. And so here's the main point. Here's the big idea. When you courageously pursue God's will, evil will arise. Make no doubt about it. Jesus said to his disciples before he was crucified, you will suffer trouble and you will have sorrow. And sometimes, Jesus didn't say this, but sometimes it will come at the hands of bullies and evil people. When you courageously pursue God's will, evil will arise, but the Lord is working behind the scenes. Trust that God is working behind the scenes. He will smother the rage, he will humiliate the boasting, and he will extinguish their plan of destruction. Now, let me say this. Does it mean that God will always intervene and we will always see supernatural things happen? No, sometimes there will be times. I wish that when I was in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and when I was fighting these opponents, that they would always, just by one touch or by one magic move that I learned, on YouTube, that they would all fall and submit, right? I wish that would happen. And I think sometimes in our lives, we are always looking for a God who will intervene. Sometimes God doesn't always intervene the way we want him to. But he is working on our behalf. And sometimes the reason why he doesn't intervene is because he wants us to struggle through the process and grow spiritual muscles that we wouldn't otherwise grow. If I had that secret magic move, and all my opponents always submitted, no matter how big they were, no matter how strong they were, no matter how skilled they were, would I learn all the other aspects that I would need to know in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? No. Sometimes when we walk into something, we are expecting God to provide it in one particular way. God save me. God save me. God make this easy for me. But that also doesn't work through spiritual muscles that God wants us to build, spiritual skills that God wants us to build, that we otherwise wouldn't build if we didn't go through that situation. So sometimes God will intervene, other times God doesn't intervene. But I want you to understand something. God is always there, and God is always looking out for our good and for his glory. God is always working for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. When we go through evil in trying to pursue God's will, we need to remember that God is working behind the scenes. And that in the end, either in that moment or later on in life or in eternity, we need to understand that the same way that God defeated Haman, and we'll see that even more next week, that he will smother their rage, that he will humiliate their boasting, and that he will extinguish their plan of destruction against his people. This is what we see in Esther And hopefully we can take this into our lives and see that when evil people will arise, when we are in the middle of doing God's will, that God sees us, that at the appropriate time God will protect us. God will intervene in different ways and in different situations for our good, for His glory. Would you pray with me?